So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you are tuning in. We thank you for being a part of these conversations that Kelly and I are having. We wanted to do another one because I'm getting so much feedback about the other ones that we've done, Kelly, and people are really engaging with them meaningfully, and of course we love that.
Yeah.
So we thought we'd do another one. So my guest today, I am Miriam Bellamy, licensed marriage and family therapist. This is Kelly Mathews. She is out of the Center for Family Consultation in Evanston near Chicago and in private practice for 22 years. We are both students of Bowen Family Systems Theory, which is a different way of looking at relationships in the human family. Very different from the conventional, fundamentally different from the conventional in ways that I think have made a huge difference in both of our lives. So we try to have these conversations to just sort of, bring up a different perspective on things. And I think it can be very helpful to think differently about the problems that we bang our heads against for years and years and decades. So what we thought today was just to talk about common relationship problems. You don't have to look very far if you Google gaslighting on the internet, or conflict with a child, right? Your mom and teenage daughter are just really at it, and unhappy, or distance between parents and their kids. Something we call emotional cutoff, where people just don't talk to their families. They might go for the obligatory annual holiday trip,
Yeah.
or every 2 or 3 or 5 years, or never. Addiction would be a common relationship problem. So we wanted to sort of begin to think about it from a Bowen Family Systems perspective. And actually, Kelly brought to my attention an article. Let me call that up real quick.
Mm-hmm.
By one of our colleagues, Kathleen Smith, called The Sweet Spot, where she's really talking about focusing on others, regardless of what that relationship problem is, Kelly, or focusing on self. And so if you can see, I think it's KathleenSmith.com or .net. I can't quite see, it's blocked out on mine. But I'll put the link in the blog for after.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we wanted to kind of tackle this, in facing any common relationship problem, we're talking about this idea, focusing on self versus focusing on other. What the heck does that mean, Kelly? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. So it's the primary piece of the theory, and which, of course, Miriam, the 8 components, and the primary one being differentiation of self. So that is kind of at the top of a pyramid of many concepts in the theory. Again, 8 of them. But differentiation of self really being pivotal. And that is this idea of understanding yourself as a separate individual. And that's one component. And then the other component is so closely connected to others in relationship. So the self and other. And sometimes that's called the individual and the togetherness and the separateness and all of that, the differences between being a separate self and being together with others in relationship. And just, the rub that happens when we are trying to live our lives and be goal-oriented and have focus and direction in the things that we want to do and the things that we want to accomplish, the things that we value, and the principles we have by which we live our own lives, and then how that interfaces with others, important to others. It does mean other humans in general, but Bowen theory is talking mostly about, important relationships that you have with mostly family, but also, friends, colleagues, friends, colleagues, and family. So those are kind of the components of that.
So do you know what Dr. Smith was referring to when she said the sweet spot?
I do think it's the balance, right? It's the balance between these two things, trying to figure out what's my thinking, what do I think should be done in this situation, or how do I think through this dilemma that I'm encountering with any of these important relationships, and then what do the others think? What do I know they think? Because we kind of know each other so well. We do a lot of mind reading. We get a lot of push to get ourselves over into someone else's mind and to fix them and all of that. And the idea between trying to find concern about the other, but also concern about ourselves, and probably first and foremost concern about ourselves, not in that selfish way, not in, I matter and only I matter, but really in the way that I am only in charge of myself. I only have control over me. And so that's the place to start. How am I thinking through this? What's helping me? What's not helping me? Before I start working on expressing those ideas to the other person. So I think it's about the balance between being a self and being in connection with others.
I also, and she talks about that, and I think that is a sweet spot. She also talks about the sweet spot as, I think she was kind of joking, but she's like, when one person in the relationship was doing the work, and you benefit. Yeah, she refers to the person who seeks out therapy, and if they're seeing someone like you and I who practices Bowen theory, then the idea that person is really working on themselves versus going to talk about our problem, between the two people. So the other person benefits, because when one person changes, the whole system changes. So if I make efforts towards seeing my part in these dilemmas and these, challenges, and I decide to then do something different about my part in those challenges, it's going to change the whole dynamic. Yeah. And I mean, I sort of reflect on, and I think a lot of the people who I get, at least who I'm hearing feedback from who are watching this, tend to be women who are interested in doing just that, and of course men, I'm not, they're there, but trying to be better, trying to do their part to do something better in the relationship. And I know for me, for a long time, I was pretty resentful of my husband he gets the sweet spot because I'm doing all this work.
Sure.
So if we're talking about focusing on self, how do you think about that, I guess, where someone in the relationship really is doing all this work, not feeling like they're getting the benefit or something like that?
Yeah, I think in Roberta Gilbert's book, she has a nice chapter in Extraordinary Relationships. Mm-hmm. I think it's chapter 16, or at least in the book I have, it's chapter 16, called Growing a Self.
You've read it? You've read that chapter a good bit.
A lot. I refer to it a lot because it's a very, very good chapter in my opinion. And one of the things she says in there, and I just love the title, it's a perfect title, Growing a Self. Like when we're adults, we think we're all grown up and so there's no more growing that needs to happen, right? But we're talking about a different way of thinking. And so growing a self, what does that include? And one of the things she comments in there is just about exactly what you said, which is, what do I do if I'm doing all the work? I feel like I'm doing all the work and not feeling resentful about that. And her comment was, well, of course you're doing all the work because you're doing your work. So it is your work and you benefit from it as well. If it also benefits others, fine. Ultimately, it is the work you're doing on yourself. Mm-hmm. So that you are still getting the benefits from that. You're not short on benefits because other people are also benefiting from it. So does that seem?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it took me a long time to get over to that hump where I didn't care if he was doing, with my husband was doing work or not. I just got where I could settle down finally and just not get so wrapped up in it. And, Kelly knows I do a lot of neurofeedback, and neurofeedback was a big, big part of that for me.
Okay.
It just finally, the resentment and all that kind of stuff just melted away. But that was a lot of years of work.
I think it can be a lot of work. I mean, it is, we're talking about not therapy that's going to, fix marriages in 6 months, 6 weeks, 6 months. It's a lifelong effort toward becoming more of a self, a more differentiated self. But I think that sometimes is alarming to people. The idea is that we're not looking to get to one particular outcome or another at the end. It's the process that while we're doing it, things are improving. Yeah. While we're working on ourselves, things are happening. Now, we might not see a change in behavior in the other or, real tangible things that we want to see, but it doesn't mean that you're not working, and it doesn't mean that the theory isn't taking root and working in you, so to speak.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, because I can get to, I've reached this, this amazing place, but there were so much relief and progress and all that led up to that.
Yeah.
So that's
and
really
I think too, I don't know about you, Miriam, but I think too, I talk to people about kind of a liberation, like really feeling like, oh, I don't have to be thinking, again, as an overfunctioner, card-carrying member, I don't have to be thinking, well, what are they thinking? Or what does that look? Or are they upset? Or do I need to attend to that? Or all these other things that I would be invested in for good reasons, well-intentioned. I wasn't trying to do anybody in. They were loving, caring, intentional parts on plays on my part. But they had ramifications that were not very functional in the way that I was so focused on other. That you can just let go of those things, really honestly let go of them. Now, I know a lot of people want to consider themselves laid back and totally like, oh, that stuff just rolls off me, and that's fine and dandy. Yeah, I can get there too. That's fine and dandy, but are we really doing that? When we say like, oh, they said that thing, but it didn't bother me at all, I just let it go. Did we? Did we really let it go? Or did we just kind of put it, as I like to say, in that little backpack that we keep back there and then pull it out, a year later or 6 months later or 2 years later, and it's not really, we really didn't let it go. So are we being really honest with ourselves about how laid back we are? Maybe we are, and we, sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. So part of focusing on self is being honest with yourself and not trying to force something like, I'm fine or whatever when you're really not. Is that?
I think so. Really being authentic. Those sound like such new agey words to be using, but really being, who we are. And as I like to say, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, it's not always pretty, to be honest with yourself. You are not always acting, principally and rationally. And we're saying things and doing things that are outside of ourselves, that are reactive, positions. We've all said things we didn't mean, every person on the planet. And so that, we can get wrapped up in that, and we don't have to pretend that those things don't happen. We can just say, I did that and I said that, and I'm sorry, or I should have said this, or what, we can correct that however we want. But I do think being honest with yourself, sometimes brutally honest with yourself, is really important if you want to get at what's going on and how you're doing it.
Yeah, and I think I'm sort of going back to thinking about when I first started making attempts to be honest with myself and with my husband and so on. And initially it was, and for a long time, it felt like this heavy thing. I had to admit that I was wrong or that I was flawed or whatever. Now it's more, oh yeah, pardon my French, if anybody's got a child around. Yeah, you know what? I'm an asshole. And it's lighthearted, and it's, you're on to the next thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, of course, because we can be, we can be easy on ourselves. We don't have to always be hard on ourselves. Overfunctioners are pretty hard on themselves. We don't always have to be hard on ourselves. We can go, what? I screwed up, or that wasn't the right thing to do, or I got all involved in that kid's business, with their athletics or whatever. Yeah, I shouldn't have done that. I was anxious. I wasn't thinking for self, and I got focused on some other thing to sort of absorb myself, and again, absorb the anxiety. Instead, bring it back to self. What's going on here? Why would I start going for that stuff? There's got to be some impulse here that I'm not really paying attention to, being honest about, noticing, observing. And that is, the key to working on self is got to be the observing. That's got to be the first move. If people jump right to doing things differently, without having observed, when is it that I get out of myself? When is it that I get involved in the other? And overly involved in the other. And those observations have to occur first. We have to know what we're doing, what we're working with.
What problem we're solving.
Yes.
Otherwise, we're solving something that may not be our part in the problem.
That's right. That's right. It probably is mostly not our part in the problem, because we haven't taken the time and the work to think about how we're responding and how we're thinking about that thing that's coming up. And then we're just moving right to the second step, which is, doing something. So it does take that observational step first, for sure.
So what I wonder if listeners are wondering is, how is this not conventional? There's so much common sense in it, right? Without self-blame, just make efforts to try to observe your own part in a problem.
Yeah.
What's different about this from the conventional approach, would you say?
It's I think lots of ways, and we've discussed some of them before, but one important way I think is to automatically focus on the problem. That is a very common move in conventional therapies. People come in with a problem. People don't just come in when there's nothing going on, right? They have a problem. And
so for example, a couple might come in with a sex problem or a money problem or a communication problem, and the conventional approach is we're going to look at that problem and try to tease it out or whatever.
Yeah, fix the problem. Who's most responsible for the problem? There's some side taking oftentimes for therapists who are not, versed in really maintaining neutrality in a real, that's a whole nother subject, right? The neutrality piece, but from a clinical perspective, but really, really being neutral about talking to two people about their marriage and using the problem as a way of getting at the process by which people think and act, not uncovering the problem. So the problem is just the content, but the process is really what you and I are after. We're after the underneath stuff that's going on for each, individual. And each individual, of course, that leads right into, all these things are connected, leads right into family of origin, because who we are as people, as individuals, has a lot to do with the families we grew up in. So that's, of course, not to be missed either, the connection between that. So you've got two people coming at it from two different perspectives because they grew up in two different families, and then coming together and trying to work on things together.
So with that, looking at the family, bone theory also then looks at it from a different perspective from the conventional as well. Now, we've talked about it, but, not watching all of our videos, Kelly. So.
For sure. Yeah. Lots of history being taken in terms of what was it like growing up? What were your parents' marriages like? How did you interact with your siblings? How did you interact with your parents? What about grandparents? What about aunts and uncles? What was the extended family milieu like? And each person getting hopefully interested in that for themselves. And that's not very conventional. That's a pretty clear Bowen thing that people.
Well, and in conventional,
really
sorry to interrupt. In conventional, I think the focus would be also, if they're doing a family history, on parents, or who's the messed up one, who hurt you, who.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think it is, again, hard to get off of the focus on a problem. Addiction is horrible, right? Families can get very worked up about that. Understandably so. I totally get it. But focusing on that problem versus what compelled someone toward a substance or any other addiction, there's lots of them. This part is interesting. That's sort of the end result of what they did with that anxiety and that angst and that less differentiated self. But how did that fall out? Mm-hmm. That's what I think, if people could get interested, Miriam, we're often at conferences and they're talking about getting curious. How do you get curious about your part? How do you get curious about your family? How do you get curious about your relationship? Rather than this black or white, I'm wrong, I'm right, he's wrong, because then he's just going to have the opposite, right? And less about the blame and more about an understanding. I think it's just so crucial. And now, I wouldn't say that conventional therapies aren't after that, but the method for that would be, I think, pretty different.
Okay.
And again, another focus for me is conventional therapy, a lot of focus on the relationship versus starting with self. Bowen theory doesn't not talk about the relationship, but it talks about the relationship in context to the self and the relationship. And I don't know that conventional therapy to me is looking at the relationship and oftentimes finding who's the one not doing or doing this thing or that thing that's causing the relationship to be bad. Which I think, again, just sort of looks like blaming and side taking. So,
because you'll have the client who is doing everything they're supposed to, right? In the conventional approaches, I was always that client before I really sort of began to step back.
And then the outcome of that is typically then that person bringing that to the therapist, like I did all the homework, I did all the things you asked me to do, and this bozo is not doing anything. And then what happens is then you just get a further imbalance in terms of the overfunctioning and underfunctioning. You'll just get more polarized positions. And frankly, that person who's not doing because they're so focused on will get worse. That's the predictable outcome. So if that's a kid, if that's a spouse, if that's a parent, they will do worse if that's the real focus.
So I know we just have a couple minutes left. I think an important sort of subtext here is that we're not saying that people's problems that they're facing aren't real problems. Like if someone's being gaslighted, that's a real thing.
Sure.
If there's addiction, that's a real problem. If you have a child who is acting out in big ways, that's a real problem.
Yes.
So how does a person focus on themselves when someone else is such a problem?
Yeah. And for sure. I mean, again, people are not showing up in our offices with mild dissatisfaction, right? There's usually, sometimes there is something like that, but oftentimes it is some big event. Kid got arrested. Kid got suspended, husband got a DUI, big stuff. These are not trivial. These are big things that need to be handled and need to be dealt with. But the idea is, versus me trying to fix them, fix that problem, my focus would be, how do I want to respond to that problem? Is this my responsibility? How much of this is my responsibility? And what's my responsible role in this problem? Mm-hmm. And that is very different, I think, than conventional, again, which would focus on the problem and over-functioning to fix the problem. And it would get fixed. It is likely that if, 3 or 4 people put their heads together, they're going to attack a problem of, a court case or a DUI or, throw money at it, work on it, make the meetings, go to court, all of those things that people would do. You would typically fix it. Would you be right back? Have you fixed the process by which it occurred? No. Yeah. I think Bowen theory would encourage both of those. They wouldn't certainly encourage not doing anything about the actual facts and the things that need to be handled. Yes, yeah. They would also say, well, what led to this? How did this didn't just pop out of the air. Right. People don't just become alcoholics. People don't just get suspended, right? There's ongoing, people don't just get divorced. There's ongoing process. Yeah. And you're doing something and they're doing something. Your part and their part. You don't have any control over their part. You might not like their part. You might not think they're doing enough with their part, but that's not really your business. Your business is over here with you. You could tell them that it's hard and what they're not doing or doing is having an impact on you. Yeah. But you're still in charge of managing what that creates for you. Anxiety, stress, insomnia, any of the symptoms that we might be feeling that are generated from anxiety and stress. Yeah. I deal with that. And really focusing on that, spending a lot of my time on that. That's not about being selfish. That's a real clear understanding that is all I can do. It is really all I can do is manage how I respond to this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, otherwise you're playing a game of whack-a-mole.
Yep. Exactly.
If you don't address the process, it's going to pop up here, it stops here, but it's going to start here.
That's right. You'll have temporary relief from whack-a-mole. You'll get some temporary relief and things will settle down, but then you will be right back at it.
Yeah.
So that's, and that's just so common. People have a fight, they have the makeup, and then it simmers down. And then you're off to the races again because it just comes up a week later, a month later, whatever. Or the child starts having a difficulty, or your mother-in-law calls. That's right.
It's often so many places.
And the content could look different. The facts could look different in terms of what's happening, but we're talking about that underlying process, pretty much the same. Rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this conversation. It's been great to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. It's always rich to talk to you.
All right. Take care, and thanks everybody for listening in.